I'm Angela Kennecke. Welcome to Grieving Out Loud. For the next 5 weeks, I'll be bringing you conversations I had with speakers and authors at the Bereaved Parents USA Conference in St. Louis in July. I recorded podcasts with women who've dealt with their own grief and have transformed it into helping others cope.
Caleb was born first, and he was stillborn, but I didn't know what was going on. I remember them taking him and putting him at the end of the operating table, and I wanted that skin-to-skin contact. And I said, can I hold him? And everyone kind of looked at me a little horrified.
We kick off this series on coping with grief with Diane Bergeron. One of her identical twins died shortly after birth. The loss changed the trajectory of her life as well as that of her entire family. As a Ph.D. researcher, she is now focusing on how organizations can support bereaved employees. Well, Diane, thank you so much for joining me on the podcast. I'd like to start off a little bit by having you tell your story of grief and of losing a child, because we talk a lot on this podcast about older children, adult children, but we don't often address the subject of stillborn or a baby dying. And I just was hoping you would share a little bit about what happened in your family.
I'm not really sure where to start. I was unexpectedly pregnant with twins. They were identical twins, not expecting. We weren't even trying to get pregnant. It just kind of happened. And then early on, I kept seeing twins all around and multiples of things. And I remember saying to my husband, I just feel so much energy in my abdomen. It didn't make any sense. And then so when we finally went for an ultrasound, I was not surprised. I even said to the technician, I said, I think there might be two of them. And she kind of rolled her eyes, probably like she had heard that before. And then all of a sudden, there was this intake of breath. And my husband said, what is it? And it was twins. And everything went fine throughout the whole pregnancy. And even when I went into labor, so our older son was born in 2006, and it was natural delivery, 26 hours of childbirth, really difficult, painful, all that stuff, no drugs. And with this one, I had contractions. I had absolutely no pain and no sensation. I was literally sitting in the hospital bed with my legs crossed, chatting with the nurses, and they would call other nurses in to look at the monitor and look at me. And they were like, I have never. Well, and now in retrospect, with everything that happened, I feel like that was just kind of this gift of you're going to suffer after this, but you're not going to suffer before. So Caleb was born first. And he was stillborn, but I didn't know what was going on. I remember them taking him and putting him at the end of the operating table, and I wanted that skin-to-skin contact. And I said, can I hold him? And everyone kind of looked at me a little horrified. But again, I just didn't know. I didn't understand what was happening. He just had this alabaster kind of glow to him. And then they quickly said, we have to get the other baby out and shoot everyone from the room, my husband, and we had 2 birth doulas, and then put the oxygen mask over me to put me out because I wasn't anesthetized at all. And, I breathed in the glass and then felt like I was thrown back on a pillow. And then all of a sudden I felt my abdomen just being sliced open. So I was awake for the incision, and then I lost consciousness. Yeah, so that, and of course that became a footnote to the story when your child dies. And so when I came to, they told me that, both of the babies were in the NICU. They were fine. They were 6.5 pounds, 6.25 pounds, but there was something with Caleb's umbilical cord where the veins were exposed in one small part of it, which they never would have seen on any scan. And in literally the 3 seconds it took for him to go through the birth canal, the veins burst and he lost 20 or 30% of his blood. By the time they transfused him, it was 20 minutes later. His APGAR scores were 0 and 1. And so we knew that there was no normal brain activity. And so I think they had him on a ventilator, and then we had to make the decision of keeping him on life support or not. And I just, I was very clear in my mind that that was not going to be a life that I would have wished on anyone. Other people would make a different decision, but for me, it was very clear from the start, I'm not going to have him have to live that way. And so we made the decision to take him off life support. And he lived for about another day. And then, they kind of woke me. I had to have the C-section, so all that was very traumatic. And so I was in the hospital room sleeping, and it was 10 o'clock at night, and they came to get me and said, he's failing. We're going to bring you up to the NICU. And so they wheeled me up, and they called my husband, and he came. And, I said, I want to hold him. And so they disconnected him from all the tubes and the wires, and we just held him for hours, as he was dying. I don't know if you've ever experienced someone dying, but at least with an infant, there's something called agonal breathing. And it literally it's this heavy, raspy breathing, and it sounds like they're in agony. Even though the pediatrician said that, he wasn't in any pain, and he was giving him morphine to kind of dull that. But it was, it was incredible. It was traumatic.
I'm thinking about this, and I'm so sorry, and it's just difficult to even hear. But at the same time, you're having this traumatic tragedy happen. You have a new baby, which is supposed to be a joyous time. So you have both things going on at once. Like, how did you reconcile that? Or did you reconcile it?
Well, and not only that, we also had an older child who was not yet 2, right? So a toddler and a new infant in this. And, that was, I think, one of the things that was so difficult is they were identical twins. And so for the first 3 months of Joshua's life, the surviving twin, when he would be sleeping in my arms, he would have his head tilted back and his mouth open a little bit, and he looked just like Caleb did when he was dying. And so, finally at about 3 months, he started to look different, right? Grow into himself. But that was really hard to tease apart. And so it was kind of grieving while also being relieved and happy to have, Joshua there.
What does Joshua know about his brother? How old is Joshua today?
No, he's 14.
14, yeah. I mean, this was never anything that we kind of kept secret, and we would go down to the cemetery, and, I thought it was important to kind of tell him the birth story. And yet, at the same time, I didn't want him displaced by someone that was no longer here. And that, I think, was a huge realization for me. And I remember that we had joined this annual memorial walk to remember that was happening in Cleveland. And so every year on this certain date, all these families that had lost infants or young children would do this walk. And one of the things we offered to do was help people plant trees to honor their child. And we went to this one family's house. And my husband was outside helping plant the tree, and I was talking to the mother, and she took me into her family room and showed me above her fireplace mantle. She had done almost like a rubbing of the tombstone that had her child's name on it, right? Because her child had died, and so this was kind of a memorial thing. And she said to me, we went to the cemetery on Christmas Eve and made that. And she had 2 other children. And I just remember thinking, she's pushed her living children aside to make room for the one that died. And I remember being very conscious of, I'm not going to do that, right? And needing to prioritize, the children that were still with me while also maintaining a relationship with the one that died.
Right, which is a hard balance to do, and I think a lot about that. I think a lot about that with my own surviving children. So I have 3 other children that need my time, attention, and love. And I do have Emily's artwork, like, up all over my house. I have some pictures of them, and her picture, I have some pictures of them. But I do worry in the charity and everything I'm doing in her name, I don't ever want them to feel overshadowed by her. And I think also my other children give me purpose to go on. I had a friend, and I felt so bad. She already had some mental health issues, some addiction issues. But after her son died of fentanyl poisoning, she completed suicide. And she had another son and a granddaughter and a husband. And I wrote this blog. It's called Collateral Damage on our website. And I just think about those poor other people, who have been affected by this. And I understand that she had problems she could not overcome. But at the same time, that is one of the things that keeps me going, is the other people.
I think that's true. And the other thing is there's research that shows that not that suicide is contagious, but if you are close to someone that has completed suicide or attempted suicide, it almost shows that this is a viable option, right? And so I think one of the things I was cognizant of is also how we often go through difficult things in a way is role modeling for other people, right? And it's not something that you're cognizant of when you're going through it, but I think I would look around at other people and think, well, how are they doing this? How are they managing their grief? What are they doing? How are they getting through it, right? Because there's no roadmap for this.
I think I was looking for easy answers, so I would read all these books and I would say, what's the secret here? I'm a researcher. I can figure out the answers. There are people that definitely were role models for me in grief, but yet at the same time, your journey is your own.
And I think, that this quotation that I love, that's just, traveler, there is no path. We make the path by walking. I think that is so true in terms of grief, because there's no one that can map it out for you. And it's just this process of feeling your way through it and hopefully having other people come in and out of your life to help you guide it. But yeah, there's no easy answer. And I think especially, research shows that the kinship relationship and what that loss is, right? Like losing a child is one of the most traumatic kinds of loss. And then manner of death is another big predictor of bereavement is, how did it happen and just how traumatic that experience was.
I think sudden death, and in the case yours was sudden death too. I mean, I think when you're not expecting it, you can't mentally prepare. Not that you can ever really truly mentally prepare for loss, but the sudden death is the most traumatic. So you have your own grief, you have your own loss, your own grief experience, and now you're studying grief and bereavement. Tell me about that.
The history is that I was a research professor at a university, and I was going up for promotion. And in a research university, it's an up or out system. So if you don't get promoted or if you don't get tenure, you have to leave. And so, even though I feel like I had pretty good metrics, I was getting all wigged out and anxious. And I would kind of talk to my husband about it. And one day, I think he was tired of me stressing out about it. And he said, look, if you don't get promoted, we will sell the house, buy a sailboat, take a year off and sail around while we figure out what's next for us. And so jokingly, I started calling it the Lose Cruise, right? Because that's a pretty nice alternative to not getting promoted. So then in the spring, my department sent me for some kind of leadership training, and it was really about rethinking your values and what's important to you, and that just broke things open for me. And I'm sure some of that was a result of the losing Caleb 5 years before. It just had that effect. And so I just decided, you know what? I'm done. I need out. I want to hit the pause button on my life. I want more time with my children that are still here. And it was a spur of the moment decision. We made the decision sometime in March. I think by the end of April, our house was on the market. In June, we bought the sailboat. And in July, we were on the sailboat.
Okay, I have lots of questions. Did you know how to sail, and were you afraid?
I had been on a sailboat, I think, once in my life, and I think I got hit in the head by the boom. I'm not a natural sailor. I'm still not. Like the fact that I know. It was awesome.
Does your husband sail?
Yes. So my husband actually had his captain's license. And I did take a sailing course after we bought the sailboat and after we were already in Annapolis, Maryland. But I don't think I ever really got good at it. And in fact, one time I heard my husband talking to the previous owner of the boat. And I heard him, and I was below decks. He was on top of the deck. And I heard him say, yeah, I think I'd give her like a D-. And all of a sudden I was like, wait a minute, is that me? Like, is he talking about my sailing ability? And of course he was. So I think I eventually got up to maybe a B+, but not a natural.
And you're on a sailboat with little kids.
Yes. So our children were 5 and 7 when we started the trip. And then when we got back, they were 7.5 and 9.5.
Did your family get closer because of it? How did you grow or change because you sort of took this leap into the ocean?
Well, one of the reasons that I think we did it is because the idea came up and my husband started talking about it with neighbors and friends. And I kind of tried to silence him because I didn't want people to put that pressure on us. And we were at a party and another couple said, oh, we had the opportunity to, sell everything and go live in Chile or something like that. And we decided not to do it. And I found that couple to be incredibly depressing and down. And I remember thinking to myself, like, oh my gosh, if we don't do this, we're going to be like these empty shell people and walk the earth that way. And so to me, this is a trip about kind of coming back to life. And so it just became non-negotiable that we had to do it. In terms of how it brought us together, I think the metaphor or the image is, when you see something woven and you look at the knots on the back, I feel like this trip brought all of us just so much more tightly connected.
I love that you had the courage to do it, or maybe the craziness to do it. I don't know what it is, but good for you guys. I mean, you wrote a blog about it, so people can find that online. We'll put a link. Sailing Uncharted Waters. We'll put a link to that on this podcast. And then when you came back, you got into leadership, corporate leadership, and then grief, or just tell me the order of what happened.
So when I got back, the university I was part of has a weird tenure system where you get, usually at most research universities, you get promoted and tenured at the same time at year 6. And so my promotion to associate professor was actually unanimous at every level. When I came back from the trip, it was like, 2 years later, I had to go for tenure. And even though, my research publications, my awards were better than other people in my department that got tenured, I feel like there was a feeling of, oh, no, you don't get to do this. Like, you don't get to take 2 years off and then come back and get tenure. And so I didn't get tenure. And, everyone told me that I had a lawsuit. And I decided, you know what, I don't want to live in the negative space of a lawsuit for however many years that takes to unfold. And so I just said, okay, I guess this is done. And so then it was, a little bit of time trying to figure out, well, what's next? And then this position opened up at Center for Creative Leadership, and not getting tenure turned to be the best thing that ever happened to me.
I think that's often true. Something that we think is horrible turns out to be a positive in the end when we look back at it retrospectively. So leadership in business, leadership, what are you studying?
Well, so with regard to, so my research areas, one is, women and career advancement organizations. That's one. Another one is how leaders listen to employees and how it gets employees to speak up. But then the third area is bereavement. And I feel like, there's no one working in this space of what is it like to go back to work as a bereaved employee. And I feel like the bereavement leave, 3 to 5 days is ridiculous. It's not even government mandated, right? So it depends on your organization. And that's not even enough time to plan a funeral, much less grieve.
Let's talk about that for a moment. Why do you think it is that corporate America, or most businesses, want you to get right back to work? Now, I'll just share a little personal story. In my case, I took short-term disability. I took 3 months off. There was no way I could have gone on television or really done anything in terms of the stress of my job effectively or well if I would have gone back to work within days or even a couple of weeks. And so I was lucky that I was able to do that. I had those benefits. It still wasn't necessarily easy to do. But why is it, you think, that our corporations, our businesses just believe within 3 to 5 days, if you lose a child or a spouse or your mother, that you're able to just jump right back into work? And are you able to do that?
No, I think it's absolutely insane. And I think I was in the same position. I had the luxury of having an entire semester off and then the following summer before I had to show up to work. So I would have been non-functional if I had to go back after 3 to 5 days. I don't know why that is the expectation. I think that as a society, the U.S. is horrible at dealing with grief. I think that's part of it. I think another part of it is that not enough people have had the experience of that kind of loss to understand the repercussions and all the ripple effects. And I think it's noteworthy that it wasn't until Sheryl Sandberg suffered the loss of her husband, right, that Facebook, now Meta, changed its policy to 20 days of bereavement leave. And I think it was through Sandberg's conversations with someone at MasterCard that MasterCard followed suit, right? So often it's someone at a high level has that personal experience and then things change.
I have a couple of friends who are moms who both lost their children to suicide. And they both went back to work almost immediately, well, within, a week or so at least, and both lost their jobs. One mother had trouble getting into work on time. She had trouble functioning at work. Another mother told me that her colleagues could not handle her grief and sadness. And they felt like there was nothing they could do. Like they had to find another job or move on or do something else with their life. But it's so sad to me that employers, this other woman I know, she's very talented at what she did. She'd worked there for years, but the employer didn't value her enough to keep her on because she was grieving. Did they think she was going to be still acting like this 5 years from now? Do you know what I'm saying?
Organizations are short-sighted because I have heard so many people, and even one bereavement organization told me, I think it was people that feel like they were treated poorly while they were bereaved. Within 2 years, I think it's something like 80% of them have left their organization. Right? And that's just a testament that people who are bereaved are so sensitized to everything that if you treat them well, you are probably going to double and triple their loyalty to you. Right? But unfortunately, most organizations don't treat their employees well. But I think it's really just because they don't understand what bereaved employees are going through. They think it's sadness and that, you can kind of get back to work. And this is where even with the pandemic, with all of this focus on flexible hours, I really hope that will shift to giving bereaved employees more flexibility, because I think often going back to work can be a respite from grief, right? Like that can be a place to do that. But organizations need to understand that employees need the flexibility to work when they feel they can, right? And to be able to kind of come in and out of that grief space and then go back into the workspace.
How do you think we make these major changes in our culture, in our corporations? Got some easy answers for me there, Diane. Do you think, like Facebook made some changes, right? You said MasterCard made some changes, but we need more of this on a larger scale, especially for workers who are making, who are in hourly jobs and minimum wage jobs, and they probably have the least flexibility of anybody out there.
Bereavement and loss for people that have less privilege and are in different social class, hourly workers, is so much more intense and difficult because they don't have the support systems that someone, with more privilege has. In terms of, how to get organizations to change, part of what comes to mind is Fortune's Best Places to Work list. Why? Because even the working mothers list is they look at certain factors in an organization. Why not add bereavement to that? I think one of the first things I would like to do is just understand the experience of employees returning to work. What is that like? Interviewing those employees, understanding, what was helpful to them, what was hurtful to them, and then also the experience of managers. And this is where I do have some empathy and compassion for managers because I think they want to help, but so many people in our society are uncomfortable with grief. They really have no idea what to say. They have no idea how to support a bereaved employee.
We've had a couple of people come back to our place where I work, and I'm always trying to check in with that person every day and just give them a chance to talk. I mean, they know I've been there. They know. I don't think anyone else is doing that. I think people are just like, get back to work, And it's not because they're mean. It's because they don't know what to say. Or I just walk up and I say, how are you doing? How are things? Is everything okay? Anything I can help with? Or I'll bring them a book, or I'll try to bring them something like a little gift, just to let them know that I understand what they're going through. But I think most people probably don't get that unless there is someone else in the workplace who's bereaved,
I think it's the people that have suffered a significant loss that reach out to someone else that is newly bereaved, whether or not they know that person, because they know that they're probably not getting the support and they have some understanding of what they've gone through. The other thing I think is a lot of people don't say anything because they feel like, I don't want to upset the person, right? But that's really about that person not being able to handle the emotions. And I think what's so important is when someone is bereaved is they need to be seen in their grief. And I think it's so hard to just witness that grief, right? Without needing to fix it or stop it, to just sit with that person for a while, let them be there. Let them get it out, and then, they can kind of pick themselves up and move on.
There's a lot of rules, in most workplaces that It's hard to know for some people, know what to do. So where do you think we need to go from here? What would you, an ideal world, if you, because we talked about flexibility. Is there a certain amount of time off or something you'd like to see corporations do?
Yeah, I feel like at a minimum, I would love to see organizations offer their employees at least kind of 20 days off to be taken flexibly, right? Because what they don't realize is, that person's, the birthday of the person that died or the death day of the person that died, those are huge emotional roller coaster days. And I think it would be so much easier if people knew, okay, I have this space to do that. I've heard of a few organizations where they actually have a donated leave bank, right? So that other employees can donate some of their sick leave or vacation days to the bereaved employees. And to me, that's something beautiful because it's a way for coworkers to feel like they're supporting the person.
I wanted to end this podcast on that I heard you talk about was doing something symbolic to end your grieving, which, obviously your grieving is not really going to just abruptly end, but creating some sort of ceremony or something symbolic to show that you're going to move forward, even though you still carry that grief. Can you talk a little bit about what you did and why that was important and what advice you would have for other people?
So I think it was my husband and I were coming up on the first anniversary of our son's death. And my husband came to me and he said, I feel like we're in danger of this becoming our story, right? That we are never going to recover from this and we're never going to move on. And he said, I think we need to find a way to hold on to the love and let go of the grief. And for me, that felt really scary because the love and the grief were so entwined that it felt like letting go of the grief would mean letting go of the love. And so we decided that on the 1-year anniversary, we were going to have this ceremony of kind of this symbolic letting go of the grief ceremony. And so we went to the cemetery, and my husband had been wearing this black T-shirt for the prior month. And he ripped up his T-shirt, and we had both written letters to our son that we read out loud, of course, falling apart as we read them. And we were going to tie them to these helium balloons and, let them fly free in the sky, which I wouldn't do today because when we were on a sailing trip, we would see all these helium balloons in the ocean. So that's not a good idea.
I think I got dinged for releasing helium balloons, got dinged on social media once that I did on a death anniversary. I mean, it's a nice gesture. It's beautiful. But yeah, I've heard about the danger to animals and the environment.
So it actually kind of worked out well because what I didn't realize is that, it was late October in Cleveland and it's cold out and I didn't know that helium shrinks. And so these helium balloons we brought to the cemetery were just kind of bouncing around sadly on the ground. There was no uplift anyway. So we ended up burning the letters. And it was interesting because on the way to the cemetery, as we were driving down the road, there was a library that had this, like a connection over a road so that you could cross from one side of the library over to the other. And there was a bench in the middle of this walkway that I could see above. And there was a woman sitting there. And I just remember thinking, that's what grief is like. Like if you don't pick one side or the other, you're kind of stuck in the middle. And so I feel like that ritual for us, even though it didn't change anything, right? Like we didn't wake up the next day and everything was fine. It was as bad as it had been the day before, but it felt like at least we had put, kind of a stake in the land of the living and said, at some point we're going to reclaim our life. Like we are not going to let this destroy us. And so I think psychologically it was a turning point for us.
How do you honor your son today?
I think in some ways by the work that I'm doing. I feel like I would not be where I am now if all of that had not happened. And so to me, feeling like if I can make any impact on other people that are grieving and make that less of a burden for them, then that's a way that I honor him.
Thank you so much. It's been a pleasure to meet you and to talk to you. I'll bring you another interview from the Bereaved Parents Conference next week. Until then, check out other episodes of the podcast and read my blog on our website, emilyshope.foundation. If you like what you're hearing, please consider giving us a positive review on Spotify, Apple Podcasts, or wherever you listen. Until next time, wishing you faith, hope, and courage.